The dilemma of President Faye and the emerging political fracture. President Faye's words were measured, carefully weighed, like a subtle balance between diplomacy and caution. True to his style, he addressed the nation with that tone that had earned him the reputation of a trusted man, respected both in his country and internationally. In his speech, he emphasized the need to take a step back and consider the situation as a whole, reminding everyone of the many challenges faced by the Senegalese people. A persistent economic crisis, growing social tensions, awaited reforms, and national security issues. His message seemed clear. The real battle was not between him and his Prime Minister Sonko, but against the adversities striking ordinary citizens of Senegal. Faye was trying to rally the nation around the idea of unity and resilience. However, this call for unity sounded increasingly hollow to those experiencing the crisis in their daily lives. Political analysts, closely watching the national scene, noted that his refusal to acknowledge the internal fracture reflected a reluctance to face a painful reality: the widening rift between the two leaders of the executive. For part of public opinion, Faye's insistence on cohesion looked less like a sincere drive for reconciliation and more like a desperate attempt to retain power and maintain a fragile political alliance. His governance style, long perceived as a consensus-based asset, now seemed out of step with the political urgency of the moment. The streets were rumbling, and the patience of the popular base was wearing thin. A key component of Faye's strategy was to downplay the gravity of the crisis, highlighting his historical relationship with Sonko. He repeatedly recalled their shared past, marked by years of collaboration and mutual respect, emphasizing that their alliance was based on shared objectives. Faye's supporters saw this stance as proof of his political maturity and his willingness to avoid division in a country already crushed by massive economic and social challenges. After all, Faye's diplomatic skills had long been his greatest weapon, allowing Senegal to establish itself as a key interlocutor on the international stage, especially with Western partners. But the domestic reality was relentless. Faye's efforts to ease tensions with measured words were no longer enough to calm the growing discontent within his own party ranks. The party base, and especially the young activists who had believed in Sonko's anti-establishment message, felt increasing frustration. They blamed the president for his slowness in initiating the promised reforms, the ones that were supposed to transform Senegal and restore hope to its citizens. For these young supporters, Faye's international focus had become a handicap, perceived as a distraction. His meetings with foreign leaders, including US President Donald Trump, symbolized his detachment from local realities. For these critics, Faye had become the face of the very system they had hoped to overthrow. His caution, once praised, now appeared as a lack of political will, even an inability to act decisively against opposing forces. While Sonko was galvanizing the crowds with his fiery rhetoric and populist discourse, Faye seemed trapped in a perpetual balancing act, seeking at all costs to avoid direct confrontation. As the weeks went by, Senegal's political landscape became dangerously polarized. Faye's attempts at reconciliation, his calls for unity, and his downplaying of tensions were increasingly seen as admissions of weakness. By refusing to name the fracture, he allowed the idea to spread that he was disconnected from the people's expectations and the burning realities of his country. Analysts warned, if Faye persisted on this path, he risked alienating his own allies and reinforcing the perception of an isolated president, hiding behind diplomacy while his people demanded action. The pressing question became, could he regain control of the narrative and bring Senegal back to stability, or would his refusal to confront divisions mark the beginning of the end of his presidency? His term, once synonymous with hope and reform, was now under a magnifying glass, every word weighed, every gesture analyzed. The shadow of an open crisis loomed over Senegal, and the nation held its breath. Sonko's rebellion and the public break. July 10, 2025 will remain etched as the day Ousmane Sonko decided to break his silence. That day, the Prime Minister spoke before a dense crowd and captivated cameras. His speech was a calculated act of defiance, a thunderclap that shook Senegal's political landscape. Known for his uncompromising stance against corruption and his fiery rhetoric, Sonko struck hard from the first sentences. He condemned President Faye's leadership in harsh terms, accusing him of betraying the spirit of reform that had brought their coalition to power, and he issued a clear ultimatum. Either he was granted full authority to carry out the promised reforms, or he reserved the right to act independently. This speech was not a mere outburst, but a carefully thought-out political move. It was perceived as a declaration of independence within the government itself. For Sonko, the time for compromise was over. It was now a matter of direct confrontation with a system he considered paralyzed. Sonko's boldness took on particular symbolic weight because he delivered this speech while Faye was abroad on an official visit to the United States to meet Donald Trump. This apparent coincidence was, in reality, an implicit message. While the president was engaged in distant diplomacy, the country was sinking into frustration and impatience. For Sonko's supporters, this address was a shockwave and a rallying cry. They saw in it the proof that the era of measured speeches was over, and that only decisive action could save Senegal from stagnation. Sonko's speech publicly exposed the ideological fracture that had been simmering for months. Faye embodied stability, diplomacy, and gradual reform. Sonko carried the promise of rapid and radical change, aligned with the aspirations of an impatient youth. Young activists, already disillusioned by the lack of tangible results, were ignited by this direct rhetoric, which they saw as the only language the system still understood. In the hours that followed, the party was shaken. Sonko's allies, galvanized, rallied behind him, claiming that without his energy and vision, Faye would never have reached the presidency. For them, this was not a betrayal, but a legitimate reclaiming of a derailed political project. This scene marked the end of an illusion. The Faye-Sonko coalition, once seen as united and unbeatable, had just shattered before the entire nation. And for the first time, the possibility of a total political reshuffle became credible. Senegal's uncertain future and the war of narratives. In the aftermath of this dramatic event, Senegal entered an unprecedented zone of political turbulence. Local and international media broadcast the confrontation in loops, and each camp tried to seize control of the narrative. For Faye, the priority was to calm things down and preserve the image of unity, even if artificial, to reassure foreign partners and avoid economic panic. His advisors recommended gestures of openness and reform announcements, but his instinct remained that of a diplomat, preferring subtle balances to bold moves. For Sonko, the moment called for a show of force. He multiplied public appearances, fiery speeches, and meetings with the activist base. Each outing was a political show, designed to demonstrate that the people were behind him and that the president had to choose, act or step aside. This communication battle accelerated the country's polarization. Social media became a permanent battlefield where hashtags and viral videos opposed the supporters of order to those of radical change. For the population, the crisis had concrete consequences. Investors grew more cautious, prices rose, and economic reform projects seemed paralyzed. In the markets of Senegal, conversations now revolved around a single question. Could the country survive an open war between its two highest leaders? As tensions mounted, two scenarios emerged: forced reconciliation, where Faye and Sonko would accept a compromise to save the appearance of unity, at the cost of a clear power-sharing arrangement; total rupture, paving the way for an unprecedented political reshuffle, with the risk of lasting instability. History may remember this moment as the major turning point of Faye's presidency. His initial refusal to name the fracture and his attachment to reassuring diplomacy had created a vacuum, which Sonko had filled with the force of his words and ambition. The future of Senegal would now depend on the ability of its leaders to overcome their egos, confront the country's real urgencies, and restore faith to a population in search of concrete results. The question remained, would Faye and Sonko find common ground before the crisis became irreversible, or would this fracture mark the end of a political era and the rise of a new Senegal?